Welcome back to Journey to Novelist. This channel is devoted to new writers and those writers new to pursuing the goal of becoming a published author. And that's a journey I'm on with you. And today we're going to talk a little bit about plot development and plot structure, because that's one of the things that's going to come up as you start trying to write novels and trying to learn this whole process of putting a story together. Before we even get into the whole story structure and story plot, let's take a look at the different types of writers and the way you might approach writing. There is basically two camps here. There's the flow writers or discovery writers that like to sit down and start writing right away. And then there are those that like to plan things out, kind of have an idea of where their story is going before they start to write. These are often known as pantsers and plotters. Pantsers who write by their seat of their pants and just jump in, but discover things as they go along. And those that plot things out have their major plot points, major events, things that they want to happen in the story before they start to write. But these are the kind of two camps, and more than likely you're a combination of the two. Sometimes you do some pantsing, sometimes you do some plotting. It all depends on you as a person and how you like to write, as well as the project that you're working on. I would say that if you're writing something like a mystery, then you're probably going to be doing some plotting ahead of time so that you can get all your clues and red herrings laid out and know what happened before you actually put the mystery in place. Where a high fantasy novel, you might just jump in with some pantsing and discover the world as you go along. Now, what does this have to do with the whole plot structure and plotting process? It more affects when you're looking at your plot and your structure. Your story is still going to need some sort of structure, some sort of plot back there to hold it all together and make sure all of the major points that are needed to define a story and make a story seem whole to the reader, they're going to have to be there, and you're going to have to look at it at some point. Whether that's before or after your first draft is going to depend on whether you're a pantser or a plotter. What are these structures? What are those major points? Well, story structure has developed over the years, starting way back with Aristotle. And Aristotle came up with this idea of the three-act structure. So way back in the BCs, sometime between 384 BC and 322 BC, this three-act structure was written about in, I believe the book was called Poetics or something like that. And he basically said that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And a lot of people will just state that he said there was a beginning, middle, and end, when really there's more to it. Mainly the fact that he also mentioned that there should be a unity of action within those beginning, middle, and end. That is, each action needs to build or be related to previous actions that were taken in order to string together a story, a series of events and actions that become your story. A lot of our structures and what we know of story builds off of this. And our understanding of story has developed through the years. Hannah More came to the idea way back in 1786 that maybe we could start a story in the middle of the action and not necessarily at the beginning. Maybe we forget all that beginning stuff where we're explaining who people are and just jump right into the action. And therefore, does her story just have a middle and an end? Well, she starts at the middle and ends at the end, but all of the beginning stuff is presented somewhere in the story through flashbacks, exposition, characters talking to each other. You're still going to get the information you need in order to understand the events that you started with. So there is a beginning, and all that beginning information is still there. It's just presented in a different way. But this was a different understanding of how you could actually do a story. You don't necessarily have to begin at the beginning. You can begin in the middle. So those are kind of two options you have: beginning at the beginning or beginning in the middle and then giving information later. So we move on, we start understanding story a little bit more. And in the 19th century, Gustav Freytag came up with the Freytag's pyramid. which expanded even more on our understanding of story structure by dividing it into 5 pieces. So we're not looking at that 3 acts, but we're looking at a way of looking at story as a whole, with starting with some exposition. That would have been the beginning. We have rising action to a climax, which would be the middle, and falling action, and then a whole wrapping up of the story at the end there. And it's often presented in this kind of a pyramid format that shows that your action, your tension, and your stakes are rising to that climactic point, so you get something dramatic there towards the middle of your story, and then everything drops off after that, where you wrap things up, and it's not a lot of action, not a lot of tension. Everything kind of eases out of the story until you get to the end. This is where you're closing things up and explaining things and kind of wrapping up all those endpoints that came into being during those rising actions. You can still kind of see the 3 acts here. Beginning is the exposition, climax kind of represents at the very middle of the story, and then the denouement is the end of the story. But it was a different way of looking at things. And we continue to build on all of this information we get about story when in 1949 Joseph Campbell came out with this idea of the hero's journey. And this expanded our thoughts of the way we think about story quite a bit. We're moving now from 5 points from the Freytag pyramid into Joseph Campbell's 17 stages of the hero's journey. It starts with a known world, moves to an unknown world or unfamiliar situations, and then slowly moves back into the known world again in kind of a circle. And one of the graphs we've got, and there are many variations of this graph based on who put it together, but basically they're showing you have an ordinary world up here at the top where you're beginning your story for obviously the first 3 points before you cross this threshold into the unknown world. Then he has it broken down into a bunch of different points, things that happen in this unknown world, until in point 15 they return back into the ordinary world, and now you get to see how the characters changed from the way they were at the beginning. But they kind of go full circle in this journey. But it was a new understanding and broke our story into 17 parts, which made it a lot easier for some people to put together a story by hitting all of these points. They would have a hero's journey type, epic type of adventure. And a lot of our understanding of story moves from this as we continue to develop and either expand or contract on these 17 points. But you're going to run into the hero's journey. It is still used quite frequently in writing today. And many of the other structures and things you see will go back to this hero's journey. So it's something you should probably become familiar with if you have not. But that was not the end of our way of thinking about story. John Gardner in 1983 released a book that mentioned the Fichtean curve. I cannot pronounce this correctly. But this curve actually identifies that stories could use a crisis after a crisis after a crisis, building that tension. And this was all explained in his book, Art of Fiction. Now, unfortunately, we don't get a lot of expansion on this because he actually came up with this whole idea back in 1982, whenever he started writing the book, and the book was released in 83. And unfortunately, John Gardner did not survive past 1983 from an accident. So he really didn't get a chance to expand on this very much past his Art of Fiction book. But this curve is often represented with this little graph where we see conflict, 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 which identifies each of these little loops is a crisis and conflict that the character deals with as you have rising action. And it doesn't limit you to a particular number of conflicts. It would just depend on your story. Maybe starting out with a very little conflict, and then conflicts and crises continue to pile up as your character moves through the story, hitting the climax. And this is one of the first times that we see a graph that actually puts the climax more towards the end of the story before the falling action, and not in the exact middle of the pyramid like with Freytag's pyramid. So it's kind of revisiting the Freytag's pyramid with a new idea behind it. And this was all in his book, The Art of Fiction. But we move on and we start thinking of other ways we can approach story. And so this is one of the first things I ran into whenever I was looking at story structure, is a book called The Marshall Plan for Novel Writing, which approaches it completely differently than any of these other structures. So far, we've been approaching them in kind of a beat or story point type method, with the hero's journey having 17 stages, Freytag's pyramid having the 5 different stages, the 3 stages of the 3-act structure. But now the Marshall Plan actually approaches it. In 1998, he came out with this book where he's talking about 16 steps to writing a story, but he's approaching it through the whole crisis, goal, action, reaction method in a scene-by-scene kind of methodology, where each scene you take and look at each section as having a viewpoint character, a goal for the scene, and then something happens and the character is trying to achieve something in this actual scene. They either fail or they succeed, and at the end they either react to their failure or they set a new goal to continue forward. And this was kind of how this Marshall Plan worked, working in different scenes as you move through the story. Rather than story points, it's action, reaction, action, reaction. And it was a different way of thinking about story and not thinking about it in beats but in scenes. So I just wanted to bring this up, and this came out in, like I said, 1998 or thereabouts, and Evan Marshall is an editor, so he was writing this based on what he saw as an editor for stories. Thinking about stories in beats is not necessarily the only way to think about story structure or to go about creating a story structure. And that's one of the reasons why I put this in here. It's just to give you a different idea. But we move on and we're back again to the whole idea of story beats with Blake Snyder's Save the Cat in 2005. Now this was written actually for screenplays, for movies and things like that, but it was adapted for writing a novel by Jessica Brody. And this actually has 15 beats to it for this Save the Cat structure, starting with an opening image and then going through all these themes stated, setup, catalyst, debate, break into 2, B story, your fun and games, midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost, dark night of the soul, break into 3, the finale, and then the final closing image, which makes it very obvious that this is for a screenplay, because that final image would be that final scene of the movie that you see as you move from the story into the credits. So this is the Save the Cat beats, and it's very much used today. A lot of people use the Save the Cat, and we often see it in a grid somewhat like this, although this particular one doesn't actually show all 15 beats, it only shows 12 of them. But we have this up and down tension, and your action as you move through the story rises and falls through the story. So you're not having a constant ramping up to a climax, but you have this kind of wave to your story pattern. And it's, again, another way of looking at story. But this is not the last thing that came about. 15 beats is too much for some people and too complex, so we actually end up with something also like Dan Harmon's story circle that only has 8 stages. And this actually follows more of a protagonist transformation rather than a particular journey like the hero's journey did. But it is kind of based on the hero's journey where you're moving from your comfort, familiar zone, and you go all the way around until you get back to basically the beginning in a changed state or unchanged depending on what happens in the story. They could go through everything and fail to actually change. But this is the story circle. Character is in a comfort zone. They desire something. They enter an unfamiliar situation trying to get that something they desire. They adapt. They get what they wanted. They pay a price for it. They return to their familiar situation, either changed or not changed, depending on how they did in the whole story circle. So again, a different way of looking at story, kind of simplified and changed from the hero's journey to adapt for different types of story. So this was Dan Harmon's story circle that came out around 2009. We move on and look at even more ways of looking at story with this story structure by Dan Wells in 2013, the 7-point story structure. And this actually has the same kind of wave that the Save the Cat has, but looks at it a little different with plot points and pinch points, and starts with a hook, knowing that you want to hook your readers into story, and then finally coming up with some sort of a resolution. So hook, plot turn 1, pinch point where you're putting the pressure on your character, the midpoint, pinch point 2, a plot turn, so something changes, and then finally the resolution of the story. Again, a different way of looking at story and a different way of choosing how you plot and design your story. We also have the Snowflake Method, and the Snowflake Method came about by Randy Ingermason, I believe that is how you pronounce his name, in 2009. And the Snowflake Method had you approach a story starting with one sentence, expanding that one sentence to one paragraph, the one paragraph to a couple of paragraphs, those paragraphs into multiple scenes, then multiple pages, and you just keep building on the information that you started with that one sentence. But that one sentence was very important in that it encapsulated the entirety of your story in 15 words or less, and you expanded from there. But your kernel of your story was in that one sentence, and you built out and got more complex. And this was a method that he actually created some software to go along with it to help you go through all the ways of thinking about your story as you build up your story from this one sentence. And it was just a different way of approaching and building a story structure. The software is still available out there, but many other softwares also have the Snowflake Method as part of their plotting engines. So you can look at Snowflake Pro or the Snowflake Method for another way of approaching story. But we did not end there. We have other people that like to expand your story. If those 17 stages of the hero's journey was not enough for you, the 8 stages story circle was too little for you, then we have here a book by Bronwyn Fleetwood, who took all of this information from all of these different people, from the 3-act structure in Hero's Journey and the Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, and put it all together and came up with an idea that there was more points in there than we previously do, and came up with this monster structure. And I actually kind of like this book. It helps you to break down the story into 21 beats. So if 17 wasn't enough with the hero's journey, here's 21 beats. But it identifies these tent poles, these major points that the story hangs off of, and then breaks the story also down into 4 phases. But this is a much more detailed way of thinking about a story, and you'll see many of these same points that are covered in either the hero's journey or the Save the Cat and many of the other plotting methods, where we start with a hook. We start in the ordinary world in phase 1, move through this whole reaction and defense section in the first part of the middle. We have the midpoint, action and attack, where the character is actually attempting to solve their problems, and then returning home and the whole climax towards the end of the story. But it actually follows the story through different phases. But it is a more expanded way, a more detailed way of looking at a story. But this might be too much for some people, and they might want something more simplistic. And so we even have this method called the one-page novel outline by Eva Deverell in 2018. She came up with this way of making plotting a story very simple if you just want to get the basics of your plot down. And this basically uses the different genres in these little cheat sheets that she has, and uses a single piece of paper that she folds, and 8 points. Then the 8 points can be very specific by genre, or there are some generic ones that she has. And you can use these templates that she created to create a novel in one little piece of paper. And one of these cheat sheets I have here, where you see these 8 different points here: your resolution, your stasis, your trigger, your quest, the defeat, the shift, the bolt, and power. And there's just scenes that you might need at these particular points in a story, and you choose some of these. And the flip side of this little page that she has actually has some prompts for filling some of these out. And you just fill this out, follow her little format, and you basically have a story structure. So it's another way of thinking about a story, a different method of doing your story structure, rather than just following the beats. So this is what we're dealing with whenever we come to story. There are so many different ways and approaches to doing story. You can follow one of these beat sheets. You can combine them like Bronwyn Fleetwood did. You can pick and choose what you need, but when it comes to story structure and plot, you really have to develop what works for you based on how you write and how you think about story. And that's what all of this actually comes down to when you think about this, is that you need to find your own personal method of creating story. Because if you're anything like me, none of these are going to work 100% for you. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm actually putting together a little video series where I'm attempting to start the process of defining my own personal way of approaching story and building my story structure. And I encourage you to do the same thing, is to come up with your own personal method using all these different resources. Take those parts of it that make sense to you, that helps you, and try different things, but more importantly, write and write some more, and explore all of these different story structures to find out what is going to fit with the way you write. I hope having all of this out there gives you some place to start your search and start your reading and your exploration of story structure and plot. Thank you for watching.